everybody, to the Clinical Leadership Development 2018 and 2019 series of call-in office hours. My name is Michelle Fernandez. I am Manager of Clinical Trainings here at NAC, and today's webinar is the fourth in this year's series. And as all of you know, or those who have attended previous webinars, all of these relate directly to the clinical leadership core competencies that were developed by NAC and are supported by the online self-assessment and development tool called the Self-Directed Learning Engine, or SDLE, which was created in partnership with SkillDirector, who is a national leader in professional development. So before we get started and I pass it over to our expert faculty, I just want to review a few webinar logistics. So please make sure that you are connected to the webinar audio, either by phone or computer. And just be aware that the phone tends to be a little bit better than the computer audio at times. Your phone is on mute, and the reason for this is so that we don't hear any background noises from your office. We will be doing a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. There is a Q&A box where you could put in all of your questions. Please make sure that you send it to all participants. This ensures that everyone can see the question that you're asking and that the speakers are able to respond to it. The same with the chat box. The chat box is accessible once you hover over where the presentation is currently on your screen. There is this little circular sort of like chat-like bubble that comes up. If you were to press that, that is the chat box will come up for you on the lower right-hand corner. Again, if you could please send to all participants, and ideally please do not submit Q&As via the chat box, just so that we know that you're submitting a question in the Q&A box. Also, there is a symbol in that lower right-hand corner, and it looks like a little raised hand. During the Q&A session, if you would like to push that, your name will come up for me, and I'll be able to unmute you so you could ask your questions live, or you feel free to type it as well. And this slide here is just some information you may need if you are having any technical issues during the webinar. Our technical support person, she is on the call today. One of my fellow NAC coworkers, her name is Beth Kujawski, and you can reach her at bkujawski@nac.com or at 732-833-1129. So for today's office hour, we are focused on the general and basic operations domain, and our goal is to answer any questions that you may have on this core competency. To speak to this topic, we have our expert faculty, Dr. Matthew Weimer, MD and VP of Health Services and CMO of Valley Health Systems, Inc. Dr. Weimer is also an active member of our SDLE National Advisory Panel and a diligent SDLE user. So I will now go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Weimer.
Great. Thank you, Michelle, and thank you also to Katya and Beth and everybody else at NAC and this team who's put this series of meetings together and for asking me to participate. It's really been a pleasure to work with you, and I do appreciate it. If anybody is having trouble with audio, please let us know in the chat box at any time. So just a little bit about myself in terms of background. I have been working in the health center system since I was really coming out of residency in Ohio initially and then in West Virginia. And I started really spending time at NAC meetings probably about 4 or 5 years ago. And at some point early on in that process, I joined the clinical practice committee. And it was there that I learned about the SDLE and decided to ask for the ability to use the tool. My assumption is that folks on the call have some familiarity with the SDLE program, so I won't go too much into sort of background on that. Again, making that assumption that you're sort of aware of how this works, but I will give a little bit of information on this particular domain and some of the tasks and how the ratings kind of impact what we're talking about today. But I really took the time in between patients in a fairly busy clinical practice to go through the steps of the SDLE initially and sort of see where I was in terms of the different tasks and what skill level I had achieved at that time. And, again, did it in between patients. It was, at the time, very interesting. It was a few years ago, but that was really my first foray into this work. It was really helpful for me to kind of do that self-assessment, as I'm sure it has been for anybody else who has done this. And then going back and sort of doing some of the activities that either NAC provided or that I sort of decided to do myself to try to improve in those areas where improvement was seemed to be needed. As I go through the slides today, it will sort of look like a NAC commercial of sorts because, and truly in my experience, that's been where I've gotten the majority of this sort of activities and built the skills for myself. I do have to say that nobody on the NAC team has asked me to continually plug NAC as I go through these slides, but it's sort of going to look like that because that's really where I've found really robust resources to help me in my professional development as a clinical leader. So if there are any questions, as Michelle said, please let us know, and I will look forward to engaging in the Q&A at the end of the talk. I'll probably talk for 25, maybe 30 minutes, and then we'll hopefully have plenty of time for any questions that you all might have. So, and also thank you for being on the call. If you are taking time out for this today, we do appreciate it. And if you end up viewing this material later, asynchronously, again, thank you for the time. I think it's really valuable to take advantage of these resources. I hope it's a good use of your time to spend a half hour or so with me. So moving on. In the general and basic operations sort of domain, as you all probably know, there are several tasks. And what you see in front of you is sort of a list of all of the tasks in the domain in order from that sort of task that had the highest gap in terms of where people self-identified as their level as being to compared with where sort of you would hope people would be. So as you go through from the top down, we're really going to focus more on the top half of this. I will have slides and some examples for each of the tasks in this domain, but really the majority of what I'll talk about are those things where people have identified sort of the greatest gap. And you can see at the bottom for a couple of the tasks, people felt like they were doing quite well, and that's good to see as well. So the first task is the ability to demonstrate the ability to work fluidly with governmental units and other funding sources that support health centers. And it really doesn't surprise me that people identified this as a gap. It certainly was for me. When I did this assessment of myself, it was early in my clinical leadership pathway. I was working in quality assurance and not much else on the administrative and leadership side. And so I hadn't done a whole lot of work with this particular task at that time. And I feel like in the last few years, I've really kind of moved up from a learning level to a higher level by doing some of the things that I'll talk about in a moment. But without reading the slide to you, certainly can read it now or later. We're really looking for what can you do to sort of strive for that expert level. So what NAC has identified as sort of the components of that level are creating innovative approaches on how to navigate and leverage relationships with government entities and other funding sources that support health centers. So really critical when you think about sort of the health centers and our place in the greater environment. Anticipating how changes in legislation can impact health center operations. There are things happening sort of in very real time around 340B and other areas that we are looking at, in terms of threats and opportunities and things like that, that legislation either is having or could have an impact on. And then demonstrating the behaviors of all the levels below that. So in my personal experience, really I got my first sort of taste of what that government sort of relations and working with various entities within that world from NAC. So, again, I was not asked to make this plug, but I will. The Policies and Issues Forum, which is next month, is where I got my kind of feet wet in that regard. So, it's a chance to go and meet with our representatives, with their staff, and really make the case for why we need what we need to do the work that we're doing. And if you haven't done it, I really strongly recommend it. NAC subcommittees and committees are also a good opportunity to learn about the issues, to learn how to interact with government agencies and whatnot, and with legislators. So again, if you attend these meetings or if you are involved in any other way, I think you'll quickly find that there are ample resources there. The NAC Advocacy Center has been for me and for my organization a really valuable place to learn the skills that it takes to be successful with this particular task. And so One example at my health center where I really sort of felt like I learned more and helped others learn more was really striving to become an advocacy center of excellence at the health center. And so we had a committee form and really found ways to engage with our staff and with our patients in the community through local media and whatnot about what health centers do, and to really get people, in particular on the staff, to sign up as advocates. So again, I would recommend the Advocacy Center as a resource, really one place for several resources in this particular area. There are some links here that won't work during the presentation today, but I would encourage you, if you get materials later, or to jot them down now and plug them in later to your browser, where you can get all sorts of information on really any policy matter that affects health centers, as well as clinical workforce matters. Another area, of course, is the PCAs in our states and regions. And so I personally have gone through education and training sessions, lots of events where we kind of break into groups and discuss policy matters and come up with sort of talking points and things like that. So, and then of course you can engage with leaders and legislators at the state level through the PCA and other state and local bodies. At the health center, one way to pretty quickly get engaged in this work is to be a part of the team at your health center that works on things like OSVs, FTCA visits, whether it's like an audit or filling out the application for your deeming for FTCA, the SAC application, 340B audits, and other areas. So, there are activities that are not always the most exciting, but I think you can really learn a lot, and they're, of course, critical to what we do as health centers. So it's not only useful to you, but I think it's really important for the health centers to have clinical voices in these discussions and in these processes. So I would encourage anybody who is on a clinical leadership pathway who's not been engaged in any one or more of those areas at the health center level to try to do so. It's been, for me, very effective. So the second task is demonstrating a comprehensive understanding of the unique dynamics of the health center model. And this one's pretty easy for me to talk about because, most of us who work in health centers, there's a pretty clear mission, a pretty clear understanding of why we do what we do and why we work in this environment. And I hope that, as a clinical leader, I hope that we can kind of spread that to our colleagues. So maybe not every provider, every doctor, nurse practitioner, nurse, staff person really understands the health center mission. And so I think it's sort of incumbent upon clinical leaders to understand the unique dynamics of our model, but also to kind of share that with others at our sites. And so being a clinical leader can really help you achieve that. So I think I kind of set this up in a sort of progression. So if we are not familiar with the history of the health center movement, there was a slide early on when Michelle was talking that just talked about the mission and sort of the, what NAC's done since 1971. And so I think along those same lines, it's worth researching really the overall health center movement. And so there's a really nice YouTube video. Again, there's a link here that you can use to view that later. But just familiarizing yourself and your colleagues and staff with the history can be, of course, educational, but also kind of inspirational as we do this work. One of the basic kind of skills that the folks at NAC have identified, and I think if you, again, work in this world for any period of time, you pretty quickly catch on to the fact that there are lots of acronyms and abbreviations and lingo, a sort of specific lingo that's unique to us. And so, just familiarizing yourself with all that is really a foundational component of this task. But then beyond that, what makes us different? So how do we fit into the health systems in our communities, in our region, and really across the country? And so one example in my local environment is working in the substance use disorder treatment world. So I'm in West Virginia, where we are really at the epicenter of the crisis, really, by pretty much any measure, whether it's overdose deaths, hepatitis C, infection rates, which is, of course relates to the SUD epidemic, and other areas. So, in our community, there are law enforcement and social services and healthcare organizations all sort of coming together to try to find ways through this. And in our health center, we developed, along with a couple of other important healthcare organizations from a school of medicine and a couple of hospitals, something called PROACT, which stands for Provider Response Organization for Addiction Care and Treatment, and I would encourage you to look it up. It's a really unique model in the face of this epidemic, in that it really allows for sort of any facet of treatment for this. In our case, as a health center, we're providing the medication-assisted therapy and some of the other things related to MAT, but then there are other entities providing job training and abstinence-based therapy and things like that. So again, we as a health center, I think we're uniquely positioned to really participate in a collaborative model like that seems to be working. It's early, but I think it's going to be successful. And, whether it's SUD or anything else that we deal with on a kind of public health level, locally or beyond, I think the health center model can kind of find its way into those collaborations and can offer something that others might not be able to offer. And so I think collaboration is one way to do that. I also think it's important to sort of understand what's the outlook for health centers, for your health center, for all health centers, looking out 5 to 10 years. So what are the issues around funding, around different payment models? We're hearing more and more and really facing more and more around value-based care. There's a lot of stuff coming out around artificial intelligence in healthcare, and I think it's really important that we try to keep up with these changes and sort of understand, again, how the health center model can respond to some of the innovations that are happening in healthcare. So for me, I try to stay on top of these changes by being engaged in an ACO as a medical director. So I'm a local medical director for an Aledade ACO in West Virginia that's made up entirely of health centers and is approaching 35,000 patients. So it's a large undertaking. It's hopefully going to be successful. And for me, it's been tremendously educational around sort of what really makes value-based care work and how to do it right. So again, if you are not engaging in activities like that can help kind of increase your understanding of, in that example, new payment models, it's I think very helpful to be involved in any way that you can, sort of in those initiatives to sort of learn as you go. There are also, again, getting back to NAC, there are certainly plenty of resources, and just I think yesterday I received an email with the updated Community Health Center chart book. There's a link at the bottom, and it's I think 92 or 96 pages long. Don't let that scare you. It's really kind of easy to navigate. There's a really useful index at the beginning, and it gives you just any number of infographics and charts and things that really kind of shed light on what we do as health centers. So, if you want to look at what makes health centers unique, what we do in communities that makes us maybe different from anybody else, this particular resource has a whole lot of information that can be educational, but also can be a resource for you to share as you're engaging with others on what we do. So the third task, again, we're getting kind of more into areas that people had more comfort with, is marketing. So leveraging marketing opportunities in social media to enhance the health center's image in the community and with external constituencies. And so the sort of expert level of this is really having a regular presence through blogs, through online, social media and whatnot that really specifically addresses primary care issues and what your health center is doing to address them. People are regularly asked to speak at events. And again, as you get down into the more skilled and applied behaviors, whether that's engaging, again, with a Facebook page or, it feels almost cliche at this point to talk about Facebook, but we've learned in our health center that, it's a really inexpensive, really affordable way to get the marketing, the message out there. So I think, capitalizing on that opportunity makes a lot of sense. And while the clinicians may not be the people driving those initiatives in your health centers, you can certainly be involved. One thing at my health center that we did that I thought was really effective in engaging clinicians was a series of videos. We did have a collaboration, or we worked with an outside marketing firm for the sort of technical side, but we did very brief interviews with several clinicians and nurses and others in our health center on specific topics, and we share those on social media. We share them on TV screens in our lobbies, and it's been very effective. So whether it's talking about flu vaccination or our chronic care management program, you could really do anything you wanted to. It's a way to kind of extend some of this engagement on marketing beyond the clinical leadership, but to other people in the organization. So I think it's important to sort of understand your health center's brand, be able to talk about what makes you different, like we talked about with the previous task. Work with a firm if you need to, or have some internal marketing staff. But again, as a clinician, be engaged in those efforts. It can really be beneficial. People want to hear from the clinicians in a practice. You can certainly be engaged in community events, so whether they be health fairs, fundraisers, sponsoring sporting events, and having a table present at a state baseball, tournament or something like that. Being on boards of other organizations. So I am engaged with our local hospice, for example, and there's so much crossover in what I do in my clinical practice, what I do as an administrator in a health center, and then, with that role in the hospice world and on their board, that I think you can bring a kind of unique voice to those boards. But also, again, it kind of serves as a way to kind of market what your organization is doing. It can be really effective in that way. And then getting back to some of the previous tasks, it all kind of ties together. You do want to be able to, make that case for what health centers are doing that is uniquely valuable to FQHCs. So kind of keep that in mind as you're out there engaging with other partners in the community. So the next task is to continually build knowledge and expertise through industry networks. And this kind of ties in a little bit with the last one, where you're going to be serving on community boards and whatnot. But certainly being engaged with NAC, being engaged with your PCA, being engaged with your professional organizations. So whether that's the AAFP, the AMA, there are ample opportunities to engage with other organizations like the AHA and folks around blood pressure control, initiatives, and the you name it. So one thing that I think is sort of unique to this slide is this idea that we have, of course, we're all familiar with UDS, and we have a pretty good understanding of what UDS measures entail and how we can kind of get better at them when it comes to the clinical measures. Knowing that there's so much crossover with, for the most part, guidelines that are put out by these various organizations, the USPSTF, looking at HEDIS measures, and maybe even at certain levels having the ability to have an impact on updating guidelines. So I think that, clinical leaders are really not only a great resource for helping to affect change around some of these measures, but also should feel kind of compelled to let your voice be heard when you see something that doesn't really make sense, that doesn't fit with the evidence, or that doesn't sort of fit with other sort of widely accepted guidelines. And so there are a number of clinical leaders that I've met who are really on these committees who are helping to kind of create and update these guidelines. And I think that it's, sort of in my vision, the expert level of this particular task is really helping to shape some of that through professional organizations. And again, it ties into some of the other tasks, but collaborating with local other healthcare organizations, whether they be hospitals, private practices, medical schools, et cetera, is a great way to kind of build those networks and build knowledge as a result. ACOs, HCCNs, research groups in West Virginia, we have several. The ones I'm involved with are called the West Virginia Practice-Based Research Network and the Alliance for Creative Health Solutions. So really partnering with other health center clinicians and people outside of our workforce on research activities can be just a wonderful way to network. So understanding and assisting and providing oversight in UDS reporting, this one for me came pretty early in my work in quality assurance, and probably for anybody who's on the call who's a clinical leader, I would assume you have some pretty good familiarity. You may be close to the expert level on this already. But again, as with the other tasks, in my mind, it's so critical that the clinical leaders in our health centers have some input as to how the health center is developing and creating workflows to really maximize performance for the clinical measures for UDS. And so whether that's EHR, clinical decision support tools, clinical workflows, and things like that, it's just, I can't overemphasize how important it is for clinical leadership to be engaged in that component. So I think that probably resonates with all of you pretty well. I think that it is a really great opportunity to collaborate with the informatics teams in your health centers. And so to me, sort of the best practice would be for the clinical and informatics leadership team members to sit down and just really have work sessions to optimize how we're entering data, collecting data in a way that really decreases the negative impact on the clinical staff. So, so they don't just feel like they're checking boxes, but that they're able to get that data in there in such a way that it is seen and can be used, but it's not creating barriers for them. And so I also think along the same lines, the clinical leaders can identify ways to apply population health strategies to improve care through, registries of patients with care gaps and other kind of related things that I'm sure you're familiar with. And then having EHR tools to improve EDS, again, through clinical decision support and health reminders and things like that can be really useful. Effective leadership qualities is a little bit harder to, for me to talk about specific tasks, but certainly there are ample activities that NAC provides. I would say that one of the best, most recent examples is that in a previous meeting for this particular series of meetings, there was a discussion on resiliency and finding joy in work. And so, if we're thinking about having emotional intelligence as clinical leaders, on sharing the idea of EQ and mindfulness, I would go back to a previous session for this group and ask you, if you haven't looked at that, to do so, because again, it's a way to build those leadership qualities. There are any number of other things that are listed here that we can look to, but learning how to delegate, building our own emotional intelligence, helping to guide people through challenges that do increase joy and resilience and decrease burnout and moral injuries. Certainly for me, the sort of most succinct way to think about this. There are any number of resources at NAC and the PCAs in the various states on leadership training, and I think that we all have opportunities to learn there. So I would encourage you, if you haven't already, to take advantage of some of those. But I would probably start with that most recent SDLE on resiliency and joy in work. Helping the clinical team, this is one where we saw that there was a positive gap. So there was people felt pretty proficient in this task, but helping the clinical team toward patient self-management and real, true patient-centered integrated care, wellness, and health promotion. And so the expert level is advocating in the community for self-management and whole person care, wellness and health promotion. And this, again, goes back to speaking at events, writing in social media, writing articles in newspapers and other publications, but also looking at the industry for innovative approaches to deliver patient-centered care. So we, I think, have to always be on the lookout for, what technologies are out there that can help us and which ones actually make sense versus when we're just being sold something that can be quite expensive and not terribly effective. And I think, having the clinical perspective on those decisions is really critical. Having processes in your care teams that really do lead towards this patient-centered care is really critical. And it's, practice transformation is, if you've gone through it, most of you are probably recognized as patient-centered medical homes. It's really challenging. It takes time, but it's so fruitful when it works well. Having team meetings, having huddles, asking team members to really help identify those patients who need that extra level of support, whether it's care management, a care coordinator, a navigator, is a great way to get started to that end. So there are some great resources on patient-centered medical home. There's a link on your slide to sort of the ultimate kind of guide, but there are others as well. So just think about the full team. Think about the clinicians, the clinical staff. In my health center, we use clinical pharmacists to great end. They do really wonderful work for us. We have diabetes educators, psychologists, care managers, and others, and really do try to implement that daily huddle and work towards really integrating behavioral health, whether it's patients with very specific behavioral health needs or patients who have sort of medical conditions that lend themselves well to behavior change, and in which case the behavioral health team can really affect a positive impact. And we really do try to have warm handoffs and integration, particularly in the case of crises where we have a integrated behavioral health provider on site. So getting towards the end here, again, another area, a task where people felt pretty proficient was demonstrating advanced proficiency in office technologies. And whether we like it or not, we've kind of been thrown into this world where we have to have EHRs, and learning how to interact with technology is just a fact of life in this day and age in healthcare and outside of it. But I think there are always opportunities to look at new approaches on how to leverage technology to help with decision making, as it states here. So that would be sort of the expert level for this task, but also teaching others how to do it, teaching others how to sort of not let technology be a barrier, but to leverage it to be assistive in what you're trying to accomplish. And just, being able to use all the various softwares that are out there from the basics like PowerPoint and Excel, but in my mind, sort of next level is population health software, and things like Tableau can be extremely useful in helping you to achieve, whether it's decreasing care gaps or just having registries of patients who need something. A clinician who can really navigate that technology proficiently, to me, is really reaching that expert level in this task. So ways to get there. I, for several years, have attended the annual conference of our EHR vendor, which happens to be Greenway for my organization. And that, I, especially early on, the first 2 or 3 times I went, really learned so much and brought back things that I could, share with my colleagues and move us to a better place. Again, having the clinical perspective is really key. So if the IT folks who are brilliant are going, but they don't fully understand the clinical side of things, you might miss out. So having maybe a team of people, if you have the resources to attend these meetings, can be really, really beneficial. If you have a health information network in your area, and most people do, some have more than one, working with them on ways to interface, to get ADT feeds, and to sort of let them help you to sort of keep your arms around your population that you're serving can be really helpful. Modernizing your health center, going green. I know NAC has gone green for meetings, and it's not a tough transition in this day and age to really work towards that modernization. Being a clinical super user of your EHR, I think, is really beneficial. People will come to you for help, and you're a good voice, I think, as a clinical leader to help others sort of adjust to new technology if you're proficient and capable. And I know many health centers have chief medical informatics officers. There may be one or more on the call today. I think that's a really unique model, and probably for that expert level clinician, that seems to be the pinnacle. So that wraps up the sort of main content that I wanted to share with you. Again, I wanted to leave ample time for questions and answers. So I will turn it over to Michelle and Kasia and Beth and see if anybody has anything to discuss.
Thank you so much, Matt. That was absolutely wonderful. Thank you for the presentation. And we do have one question that came in. Let me just pull it up really quickly. So the question asks how to engage providers into the leadership role. Specifically, they're talking about when thinking about session planning, how they're able to get providers to step up into that leadership position, and if you have any better ideas to help prepare leaders within health centers.
That's a really great question. I have a couple of fourth-year medical students with me in these last couple of weeks, and they're beyond that point where they're asking a whole lot of clinical questions. So we're now talking about sort of professional development and how they, as they get beyond their residency, how to sort of engage in the healthcare environment. And we just talked about that today, actually, about the need to have clinical voices engaged in leadership. As health centers, of course, you have to have some degree of that. But how do you identify somebody who can sort of be in line to step in? I think just asking people and looking to people who have shown interest, sort of not making assumptions about what people may or may not want to do. I think there's a common sort of misconception to some degree. It's probably not that much of a misconception, but there is this common sort of thought that clinicians want nothing to do with administrative work. They just want to do their jobs. And I think that we can try to tease out those folks who actually do have an interest, try to help them develop themselves through programs like what we're talking about today. And, again, not making assumptions, but just asking folks is a good place to start. I think letting people know that they've been identified as having some strengths that lend themselves towards future clinical leadership can go a long way to sort of help people start thinking along those lines. I think people that I've spoken with often don't think that they have what it takes, that they, would be, seen as somebody who could potentially lead. And there's no doubt there are plenty of people who do really run the other direction, but I think by asking people, by helping people to develop, letting them understand the impact of their work can be really effective. I also think that sort of making the case that, this kind of engagement is still it still has an impact on patient care, just in a different way. So, you can develop policies and workflows and, find the software and build the teams that can really affect your population of patients, may not be that sort of one-on-one, face-to-face impact that so many clinicians, really set out to do when they took this path. But you can do that, and you can also do it on the administrative side. And so just kind of reminding people or giving examples of how they can affect that kind of patient level change through this work is probably, for me, something that kind of motivates me and keeps me energized, and probably, hopefully, would for sort of up-and-coming clinical leaders as well.
Great, thank you so much. So we do have another question, but before I read it, I just want to remind everyone, if you do have any questions, please submit them via the Q&A. You could also submit them via the chat. It's just easier sometimes to pinpoint the questions via the Q&A. And if you would like to read your question out loud, please just use the raise hand symbol, and I will go ahead and unmute you. So really, there's any way that you would prefer to submit your questions over to us. So Matt, the next question that came in is asking, when would you consider having an associate director, or do you just have a site director for each site and you as the CMO?
That's a really great question. I think it really depends on the culture at your health center and the size and the footprint. So my health center is rather large. We have over 30 sites with about 72,000 patients in several counties over, a few hours, drive from one to another in some cases. So you really have to kind of apply ways to scale the work that you're doing to the size of your health center. So I certainly have talked to health centers who have one clinical leader at every location, and I think that's a model that really seems to work well. In our ACO, we have a clinical lead at every site. We also have a site champion at every site, so we are engaging a physician or a nurse practitioner or a PA, as well as a nurse or somebody else like a care manager in our sort of regular contact. So I think that, again, it depends on the culture. In my health center, we do not have clinical leaders at every site, but we, in the form of like a physician or a nurse practitioner or PA, but we do have a nurse and front office leader, and so they're the ones who really, we filter information through them. They're the ones who are sort of on the front lines, implementing new processes, letting staff know about new policies, and so I suppose it depends on what your administrative team wants and what your goals are, but I think that any model, whether it's having site by site within your health center or a more centralized clinical leadership team, utilizing then non-clinicians but other people to sort of lead the way at the sites, either way I think makes sense depending on your culture.
Wonderful, thank you. So I'm just going to give everyone a few more minutes to see if they have any other questions that they would like to submit. I just want to make sure that I didn't miss any of them. Nope, so we still have about 15 minutes left, but we are, if we don't have any other questions, we definitely could end a little bit early, but I do want to let everyone know, first of all, thank you for joining us, and thank you so much, Matt, for your excellent presentation and your very thoughtful responses to all of the questions that we had. Just so you know, our webinars and all of our office hours, they're always recorded, so they will also be mapped into the SDLE so that you can use them as a resource, and as well as an accompanying self-paced e-learning module will be created to go along with this webinar. As you know, recently we started releasing a resource guide through our communications that we send out to all of our SDLE users. So that is where you will get the link to be able to access this recording in the MyNAC resource library, and we will also let you know once it is mapped into our SDLE. And as a reminder, all of these office hours are directly connected to the core competencies and your self-assessment. So we really do strongly encourage you to go ahead and log back into the SDLE and reassess yourself, because the hope and the goal with all of these office hours is that you're able to bridge your gaps through the information that you learn here today. Finally, I also want to remind you that we are having our next office hour on April 17th. It is based on the quality management domain, and it will be from 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So as of right now, I actually don't see any other questions. Give everyone another quick moment. But if there is nothing else, then again, I just want to say thank you so much for everybody for attending, and thank you so much, Matt, for all of the information you provided today.
Thank you for the chance, and thanks everybody for participating.
Thank you.